August 22nd, 1944, 9 o'clock in the morning. High above the Italian Alps, silence was about to become the deadliest weapon in the war. Captain Jack Reynolds sat in the cockpit of his P-47 Thunderbolt, staring at a small red lever. That lever controlled the fuel mixture to his engine. In 30 seconds, he was going to pull it all the way back. He was going to kill his engine on purpose. He was going to turn 7 tons of fighter plane into a falling brick. And if everything went according to plan, he was going to destroy the most heavily defended target in Italy before the Germans even knew he was there. The problem was simple. Every time American planes approached the Brenner Pass, the Germans heard them coming, not saw them, heard them. The Luftwaffe had installed acoustic listening devices all through the mountains, giant metal funnels that could pick up the sound of aircraft engines from 10 miles away. The moment those listeners caught the roar of American fighters, telephone operators would alert the flak batteries. By the time the P-47s arrived over their targets, German gunners were already waiting with their fingers on the triggers. It was a perfect system. The Americans called it the zipper. You flew into the valley and the curtain of flak closed on you like a zipper. Dozens of pilots had died trying to bomb the rail lines that snaked through these mountains. The trains that carried German ammunition, fuel, and reinforcements south to the Gothic Line always made it through. Always. Reynolds had watched his friends get shot down one after another. Good pilots, brave men, dead because the enemy could hear them coming. He had spent weeks trying to solve the puzzle. How do you sneak up on someone who can hear your engine from the next county? Then one afternoon, flying a routine patrol, he watched a hawk hunting in the valley below. The bird didn't flap. It folded its wings and dove. Silent, fast, deadly. The rabbit never heard it coming. Reynolds wondered if a 7-ton fighter plane could do the same thing. The P-47 Thunderbolt was not designed to be quiet. It was designed to be intimidating. The massive radial engine produced 2,000 horsepower. The turbo supercharger screamed like a banshee. When a formation of Thunderbolts passed overhead, people on the ground felt it in their chests. The British Spitfire pilots joked that Americans had taught a locomotive to fly. But Reynolds had discovered something during unauthorized test flights behind Allied lines. If you climbed high enough, cut the engine, and adjusted the propeller pitch just right, the Thunderbolt could glide. Not well, not gracefully, but it could glide fast. 300 miles per hour in a shallow dive, silent as death. He had pitched the idea to his commanding officer. The colonel looked at him like he had suggested they all jump out of their planes and flap their arms. "The P-47 has the glide ratio of a crowbar," the colonel said. "If that engine doesn't restart, you're not landing. You're crashing into a mountain." The idea was officially banned. Reynolds was told to stop playing test pilot and stick to the manual. Then the intelligence report came in. A German ammunition train was hiding in the Avisio tunnel. 30 cars of artillery shells destined for the front lines. The tunnel was carved into a vertical cliff face. It was protected by concrete overhangs that made high-altitude bombing impossible. The entrance was guarded by the deadliest flak battery in the sector. 4 quad 20mm cannons positioned perfectly to shred anything that came within 2 miles. The colonel looked at the map. He looked at Reynolds. He didn't say much. He just pointed at the tunnel and said, "I don't care how you do it. Just don't tell me about the physics." Now Reynolds was at 12,000 feet, 8 miles from the target. His wingman, Lieutenant Red Miller, was tucked in close on his right. Miller thought this was a standard dive bombing run. He had no idea his flight leader was about to commit the cardinal sin of aviation. Reynolds checked his instruments one last time. Oil pressure good, manifold pressure steady. The big Pratt & Whitney engine was humming perfectly. It was alive. It was warm. It wanted to run. Killing it felt like murder. He took a deep breath of cold oxygen. The air at 12,000 feet was 20 degrees below zero. He wrapped his gloved hand around the mixture control lever. He didn't hesitate. He yanked it all the way back to idle cutoff. The effect was violent and immediate. The engine banged once, a loud backfire that shook the entire airframe. Then it died. The massive propeller windmilled for 2 seconds, the blades slapping uselessly at the thin air. Then Reynolds slammed the propeller control lever to coarse pitch. The blades twisted sideways, cutting through the wind instead of fighting it. The propeller froze. One blade pointed straight up at 12 o'clock. The other three formed a perfect cross. The roar of the engine vanished. It was replaced by a high-pitched hiss, the wind whistling over the canopy. Reynolds could hear his own breathing inside his oxygen mask. He could hear the creaking of metal in the wings. He felt weightless. The nose pitched down violently. The altimeter started unwinding like a broken clock. Reynolds pushed the stick forward, committing to the dive. The heavy fighter dropped like a stone for 3 seconds. Then the speed built. 200 miles per hour. 250. 300. The 7-ton brick stabilized. It was falling, yes, but it was falling forward. Fast. Reynolds was now gliding. A 7-ton fighter plane with a dead engine was gliding toward the most heavily defended tunnel in Europe, and he was doing it in complete silence. He dropped below the mountain peaks. The white snow-capped summits passed above him. He was entering the canyon now. This was the point of no return. If he tried to restart the engine, the sudden noise would echo off the cliffs and alert every gunner within 20 miles. He scanned the valley floor ahead. Railroad tracks, supply depots, and there, at the base of a massive cliff, the dark mouth of the Avisio Tunnel. The flak towers were exactly where intelligence said they would be. Concrete bunkers built into the rock. He could see the barrels of the Quad 20 cannons pointing at the sky. He could see the gunners standing around their weapons, smoking cigarettes, scanning the southern horizon. They were listening for the roar. They were watching for the black specks of American planes. They didn't look up. They didn't look north. They had no idea that 7 tons of death was falling toward them from behind, sliding down out of the sun in total silence. Reynolds adjusted his grip on the stick. The plane was heavy without engine power to assist the hydraulics. He had to wrestle the controls with both hands. The ground was rushing up fast. He was at 350 miles per hour now. Then a flash of light caught his eye. High above, on a jagged peak to his left, a German spotter had turned his head. The man had seen the glint of sunlight on Reynolds' canopy. Reynolds watched in horror as the spotter raised a flare pistol. A bright red ball of fire arced into the sky. The signal. Enemy aircraft spotted. But the spotter was confused. He fired only one flare. Not the double red for imminent attack, just a single red for possible aircraft. The man probably thought Reynolds was a damaged German plane limping home. From a distance, the P-47 silhouette looked similar to a Focke-Wulf 190. The gunners in the valley saw the flare. They turned their heads. They looked at the spotter. They started pointing and arguing. They weren't running to their guns. They were hesitating. That hesitation was Reynolds' window. 2 miles out now. The tunnel mouth was growing larger in his gun sight. He could see the train, a long black snake of steel cars, half hidden inside the mountain. The locomotive was deep inside the tunnel, but the last 10 cars were still exposed. Reynolds lined up his approach. He wasn't aiming for the cars outside. That would just damage the tracks. He wanted to kill the entire train. He had to put his bombs inside the tunnel. He had to skip them through the entrance at 350 miles per hour with a dead engine. Then the situation changed. The spotter on the mountain realized his mistake. He fired a second flare, then a third, double red, triple red, enemy attack imminent. The gunners woke up. They scrambled into their seats. The barrels of the Quad 20 cannons swung around, searching. They didn't know where the plane was, but they knew it was coming. They started firing blindly into the air. A box barrage, a wall of exploding shells directly in front of the tunnel. Reynolds gripped the stick until his knuckles turned white inside his gloves. He was 1 mile out. He was gliding straight into a curtain of fire. He couldn't pull up. He couldn't turn. He had no power. He was a passenger in a falling bomb. The air ahead turned black with flak bursts. The German gunners were panic firing. They couldn't hear an engine, so they were confused. They aimed high, filling the sky at 10,000 feet with a wall of shrapnel. They assumed the American plane was diving from altitude with its engine screaming. They were wrong. Reynolds was coming in just above the treetops. so low that his landing gear was almost brushing the tops of the pine trees. The heavy Thunderbolt sliced through the air like a razor blade, silent and deadly. He was below the barrage. The black puffs of 88mm shells exploded 500 feet above his canopy. Shrapnel rained down on his wings like hail on a tin roof. But the blast waves were above him. He was surfing under the curtain of death, 500 yards out. The speed was bleeding off, 280 miles per hour. The heavy fighter was starting to feel sluggish. The controls were getting mushy. This was the danger zone. If he got too slow, the 7-ton plane would stop flying and start falling. He would stall and crash right into the flak pits. He focused on the tunnel mouth, a black archway maybe 20 feet high. The rear boxcars were sitting on the tracks like ducks in a row. But hitting those cars wasn't enough. He had to get the bombs inside the mountain. He was going to skip them, like a flat stone across water. Bomber pilots used this trick against ships. Drop the bomb at a shallow angle, and it would bounce across the surface until it hit the target. Reynolds was going to do the same thing, but instead of water, he was using the steel railroad tracks and the gravel roadbed. 300 yards. The silence was still holding. The gunners in their concrete bunkers were looking up at the sky, heads tilted back, scanning the clouds. They were deafened by their own guns. The pounding of the quad 20s drowned out the soft whistle of the gliding fighter. Reynolds was invisible in plain sight. 200 yards. His hand hovered over the bomb release lever. He held his breath. He aimed the nose of the plane at the gravel between the tracks. He needed to be close. Point-blank range. 100 yards. He could see the rivets on the train cars. He could see a German loader standing near the tunnel entrance. The soldier happened to look down. He saw a 7-ton monster floating toward him at 200 miles per hour. The man's mouth opened to scream. Too late.
Reynolds yanked the release lever.
2 500-pound bombs dropped from the wings. The P-47 lurched upward instantly. Losing 1,000 pounds of dead weight changed everything. The nose wanted to pitch up. Reynolds fought it, shoving the stick forward to keep the plane level. He watched the bombs fall. They hit the ground perfectly. They didn't explode on impact. They were set with 4-second delay fuses. They slammed into the railroad ties, kicked up a cloud of dust, and skipped. Once, twice, 3 times. They flew through the air like skipping stones, clearing the last few yards and disappearing into the black darkness of the tunnel mouth. They were in. Reynolds didn't wait to see the explosion. He had a bigger problem now. He was 200 feet off the ground, moving at 200 miles per hour, heading straight for a vertical granite cliff face, and his engine was dead. This was the moment the colonel had warned him about. The suicide part of the plan. He had to turn a falling brick back into an airplane in less than 3 seconds. Reynolds slammed the mixture control to rich. He shoved the throttle forward. He hit the starter switch. Nothing happened. The propeller was still frozen in coarse pitch. The electric starter whined, trying to turn the massive 18-cylinder engine over against the wind resistance. The prop blades turned slowly, fighting, but the engine didn't catch. It was cold. The oil was thick. The fuel hadn't reached the cylinders yet. Reynolds was staring at the cliff face. It filled his windshield. He could see individual cracks in the granite. He was going to die. He was going to smash into the mountain like a bug on a windshield. He screamed into his oxygen mask. He pumped the primer. He prayed to the god of horsepower.
"Start, you bastard!"
1 cylinder fired. A puff of black smoke shot from the exhaust stack. Then another. Then 5. The engine caught with a violent roar that shook the entire airframe. The propeller blurred into motion. Reynolds slammed the prop lever back to fine pitch. The engine screamed as it surged to 2,500 RPM. The P-47 woke up. The torque was massive. The plane twisted to the left. Reynolds stomped on the rudder pedal and yanked the stick back into his gut. The heavy fighter groaned under the G-forces. The nose pitched up. The belly of the plane cleared the top of the flak tower by inches. The blast from his wake blew the helmets off the German gunners below. He went vertical, climbing straight up the face of the cliff, engine howling at full emergency power. He was a rocket now. And then the mountain exploded. Inside the tunnel, the two bombs detonated simultaneously, but they didn't just blow up a few feet of track. They triggered a chain reaction. The train was carrying artillery shells, high explosives. When Reynolds' bombs went off, they detonated the first car. That car detonated the second. The second detonated the third. The pressure inside the tunnel had nowhere to go. It couldn't go up through thousands of tons of granite. It couldn't go down. It had to go out. The tunnel became a giant cannon barrel. A massive tongue of orange fire shot out of the tunnel mouth. It looked like a dragon breathing flame. The blast wave was so powerful it disintegrated the concrete entrance. The train cars that were still outside the tunnel were picked up and thrown across the valley like toys. The flak tower, the one with the deadly quad 20 guns that had guarded this entrance for 2 years, was erased. The firestorm engulfed the concrete bunker. The gunners who had been looking at the sky were vaporized instantly. They never heard the engine until it was roaring over their heads. By then, they were already dead. Reynolds, climbing away at 3,000 feet, felt the shockwave hit his plane. It felt like a giant hand swatted his tail. The P-47 bucked and wobbled. He looked back over his shoulder. A mushroom cloud of black smoke and dust was billowing out of the valley floor, rising higher than the canyon walls. The tunnel entrance was gone. The train was gone. The tracks were gone. Up above, his wingman, Lieutenant Miller, had watched the whole thing in stunned disbelief. He had seen Reynolds dive into the valley and disappear. He had waited for the crash. He had waited for the ball of fire that meant his flight leader had become a smoking crater in the mountainside. Instead, he saw the mountain explode. And then he saw the silver shape of the Thunderbolt rocketing out of the smoke like a phoenix rising from ashes. Miller keyed his radio. His voice was shaking. "Good Lord, Jack, you didn't just hit the tunnel, you moved the mountain." Reynolds didn't answer immediately. He was busy trying to calm his shaking hands. He dialed the prop pitch back. He leaned out the mixture. He checked his instruments. Everything was green. The beast was alive. He leveled off at 15,000 feet, back in the safety of the thin air. He looked down at the Brenner Pass one last time. Smoke was still pouring out of the hole in the mountain. It would burn for days. The rail line was cut. The ammunition that was supposed to kill Americans on the Gothic line was now scrap metal and ash. Reynolds finally keyed his mic. His voice was dry and raspy, but steady. "Target destroyed. Let's go home, Red. I think I woke them up." The flight back to base was quiet. Reynolds didn't do any victory rolls. He didn't buzz the tower. He just flew straight and level, listening to the hum of the engine. He had never loved that sound more than he did right now. The silence of the glide had been terrifying. The noise of the engine was life. When he landed at the airfield, the ground crew was waiting. They had heard the radio chatter. They knew something big had happened. Reynolds taxied to his revetment and shut down the engine. The propeller spun down and stopped. The silence returned, but this time it was a safe silence. Reynolds climbed out of the cockpit. His flight suit was soaked with sweat despite the freezing temperatures at altitude. His knees were weak. He sat on the wing for a moment, just breathing. He looked at the massive four-bladed propeller. He patted the cold aluminum blade like it was a faithful dog. The colonel's jeep screeched to a halt next to the plane. The colonel jumped out. He looked at Reynolds. He looked at the empty bomb racks. He looked at Miller, who had just landed and was running over, waving his arms and shouting about volcanoes. The colonel walked up to Reynolds. He had a stern look on his face. He was the man who had banned this tactic. He was the man who had called it suicide by physics. "Well," the colonel asked, "did you survive the physics?" Reynolds lit a cigarette. His hand was trembling slightly, but he managed a smile. "Physics worked fine, Colonel. Gravity did most of the work. I just steered." The colonel looked at the pilot, then at the plane. He shook his head slowly. He knew what Reynolds had done was impossible. It defied the manual. It defied common sense. But he also knew the impossible tunnel was gone. The impossible train was gone. And the impossible pilot was sitting on his wing, smoking a lucky strike. "Don't ever do it again," the colonel said, trying to sound angry but failing completely. "And good job, Jack. Damn good job." But the story didn't end on that runway. The dead stick attack wasn't just a one-time stunt. Reynolds had proven something important. The German defenses had a blind spot made of silence. In the mess halls and briefing rooms of the 57th Fighter Group, the other pilots were listening now. The mockery was gone. The jokes about the glider club stopped. They started asking questions. How fast do you have to dive? What's the best propeller pitch? How much altitude do you need? Reynolds grabbed a napkin and a pen. He started drawing diagrams. He showed them the glide ratio. He showed them the restart procedure. He showed them the course pitch trick. He wasn't just telling a war story. He was teaching a class. The Reynolds glide wasn't official. It wasn't in the manual. Command still frowned on it because it was dangerous as hell. But the pilots knew. When the flak was too thick, when the target was too hard, when the noise was getting you killed, sometimes the best weapon you had was the off switch. The Brenner Pass campaign was about to get a lot quieter and a lot deadlier. 2 weeks after Reynolds' mission, the ground crew noticed something strange. They were developing more gun camera film than usual. Every P-47 carried a camera mounted in the wing that automatically filmed when the pilot pressed the trigger or activated it manually. Reynolds had triggered his camera right before dropping his bombs. He wanted proof of what he'd done. The film took 2 hours to develop. Those were the longest 2 hours of Reynolds' life. He sat in the briefing tent drinking bad coffee, waiting. The colonel was pacing. He believed Reynolds had hit the tunnel, sure, but he thought Reynolds had just gotten lucky with a standard dive. Then the intelligence officer walked in with the reel. He threaded it into the projector. The room went dark. The screen flickered to life. The footage was grainy, black and white, and silent. Silence was the perfect soundtrack. The film started high, showing the nose of the P-47 pointing down at the valley. The propeller was clearly visible in the frame. It wasn't a blur of motion. It was frozen. A solid black cross standing perfectly still against the sky. The colonel gasped. Seeing a stopped propeller in flight was unnatural. It looked like a crash frozen in time. The film showed the ground rushing up fast. Trees blurred past. Flak bursts appeared as silent gray puffs in the air above, but the plane didn't flinch. It just slid underneath them like a ghost. Then the tunnel appeared. It grew larger and larger until it swallowed the screen. The colonel leaned forward. The image shook violently as the bombs released. The plane pitched up, skimming the treetops. Then the screen turned white. The explosion was so massive, it washed out the film completely. The camera caught the shock wave, ripping trees apart, before Reynolds climbed away into safety. The lights came back on. The room was dead quiet. The colonel looked at Reynolds. He looked at the frozen propeller on the last frame of the film still projected on the screen. He picked up his coffee cup, took a sip, and set it down carefully. He realized he couldn't ban this. You don't ban a weapon that works. You refine it. You teach it. Over the next few months, the 57th Fighter Group became famous for their bridge-busting campaign. They were part of Operation Strangle, the massive effort to cut off German supply lines in Italy. They destroyed hundreds of bridges and tunnels using conventional tactics. But whenever a target was too hot, whenever the flak was too thick, the pilots would look at each other in the briefing room and tap their headsets. They would climb high, cut their mixtures, and turn into ghosts. The Germans never figured it out. They couldn't understand why their acoustic listening devices were failing. They checked the equipment repeatedly. They blamed the operators. They thought the Americans had developed some kind of new silent engine technology. They never guessed that the new technology was just crazy American pilots turning the key to the off position. Lieutenant Carl Benson was the second pilot to successfully use the Reynolds glide in combat. His target was a German headquarters building in a heavily defended town near Bolzano. The building was surrounded by flak towers. Standard approach was suicide. Benson climbed to 14,000 feet, cut his engine, and glided in from the north. The Germans never heard him. He put a 500-pound bomb through the roof of the building and restarted his engine while pulling up over the town square. The headquarters was destroyed. Benson made it home without a scratch. Captain Mike Torres used it against a radar station on a mountain peak. The station was considered untouchable because it sat above the effective range of most fighters and was protected by concentrated flak batteries on all approach routes. Torres glided in from 20,000 feet, dropped his bombs, and was 5 miles away before the radar operators realized they'd been hit. The tactic worked because it exploited a fundamental assumption. The Germans had built their entire air defense system around the idea that aircraft made noise. Their listening posts, their warning systems, their tactics, all depended on hearing the enemy coming. A silent fighter was something they had never planned for. It was outside their doctrine, outside their experience. But the Reynolds glide was never easy. It was never safe. Every pilot who tried it knew they were gambling with physics. The P-47 was not designed to glide. It was designed to fight with a roaring engine and overwhelming firepower. Lieutenant James McCarthy tried the glide against a rail yard near Verona in October 1944. He climbed to 13,000 feet, cut his engine, and began his approach. Everything went perfectly until the restart. His engine was too cold. The oil had thickened. When he hit the starter, nothing happened. McCarthy was at 500 feet, gliding over a German supply depot with a dead engine. He had maybe 10 seconds before impact. He pumped the primer frantically. He tried the starter again. The engine coughed once and died. Third try. The prop turned slowly. One cylinder fired, then another. The engine caught at 200 feet. McCarthy pulled up so hard he nearly blacked out from the G-forces. His landing gear clipped the top of a supply truck, but he made it out alive. He landed back at base white as a sheet. He climbed out of his cockpit, kissed the propeller, and told the ground crew he was never doing that again. 2 weeks later, he volunteered for another dead stick mission. The target was too important. The flak was too heavy. It was the only way. The danger didn't stop pilots from using the tactic. It just made them more careful, more precise. They practiced at altitude over Allied territory. They timed their restarts. They learned exactly how far they could glide from any given altitude. Reynolds became an unofficial instructor. Between missions, he would take new pilots up and teach them the technique, not the colonel-approved way, the Reynolds way. First, you climb to at least 12,000 feet. Any lower, and you don't have enough margin for error. Then you trim the aircraft for level flight at cruise speed. Then, and only then, you pull the mixture to idle cutoff. The engine will bang once. Don't panic. That's normal. The instant it dies, push the propeller control to full course. This is critical. If you leave it in fine pitch, the propeller will act like an air brake, and you'll fall like a stone. With the prop in course, you have to push the nose down immediately. Don't try to stretch the glide by pulling the nose up. The P-47 will stall and you'll spin in. Push the nose down until you're doing at least 250 miles per hour. Then you can adjust for your approach. You'll lose about 2,000 feet per minute in a proper glide. That gives you 6 minutes from 12,000 feet. That's your window. Use it wisely. When you're ready to restart, and you must restart before you're below 1,000 feet or you won't have time to recover, you reverse everything. Mixture to rich. Throttle forward halfway. Propeller control to fine pitch. Then hit the starter. If it doesn't catch on the first try, wait 3 seconds and try again. Don't flood it by pumping the throttle. That just makes it worse. If it doesn't catch on the second try, you have one more chance. After that, you're landing, or crashing, whichever comes first. Reynolds drilled this into every pilot who asked to learn. Some caught on quickly. Others never got comfortable with it. A few tried once, felt the sickening sensation of a dead engine at altitude, and decided they'd rather face the flak. But enough pilots mastered it that the tactic became part of the group's unofficial playbook. The colonel never officially approved it. He never officially banned it either. He just looked the other way when pilots returned from impossible missions with cold engines and impossible stories. By December 1944, German intelligence reports from Italy were noting something strange. American fighter attacks were becoming unpredictable. Targets that should have been safe because of early warning systems were being destroyed without warning. Listening posts were reporting failures. Operators were being disciplined for missing incoming aircraft. One captured German flak officer interrogated after his position was overrun, told American intelligence something interesting. He said his gunners were terrified of what they called ghost planes, American fighters that appeared without sound, dropped their bombs, and vanished before anyone could react. The officer said the ghost planes were worse than regular bombing attacks because there was no warning, no engine noise, no time to take cover, just sudden explosions and death. The interrogator asked if the Germans had developed any countermeasures. The officer laughed bitterly. "How do you defend against something you can't hear coming?" he asked. "We doubled our visual spotters. We put more men on the mountains with binoculars. But the Americans fly so low and so fast that by the time a spotter sees them, it's already too late." Reynolds finished his tour of duty in late 1944. He had flown 80 missions. He had destroyed trains, tanks, bridges, and tunnels. He had survived flak, fighters, and bad weather. But his luck was stretching thin. The colonel sent him home before the law of averages caught up with him. Reynolds packed his bags, took one last look at his battered P-47, and boarded a transport ship back to the States. He didn't come home to a parade. The war in Europe was grinding toward its bloody conclusion, and the headlines were focused on the big armies, the famous generals, and the race to Berlin. A fighter pilot who bombed tunnels in Italy was just another cog in the massive war machine. Reynolds went back to civilian life. He took off the uniform and put on a suit. He got a job as an engineer for a civilian aircraft company in California. He lived a quiet life. He raised a family. He mowed his lawn on Sundays. He fixed his neighbors' cars. He was a normal guy in a normal suburb, living a normal life. When people asked him what he did in the war, he usually just said he flew fighters in Italy. He didn't tell them about the glide. He didn't tell them about the silence. It was too hard to explain. How do you tell someone that the most terrifying moment of your life was also the most peaceful? How do you explain that falling out of the sky in a 7-ton brick felt like freedom? How do you describe the sound of silence at 300 miles per hour when your life depends on physics you barely understand? The other pilots from the 57th stayed in touch for a while. They wrote letters. They sent Christmas cards. Some of them got together at reunions every few years. They would sit around hotel bars, gray-haired men in their 50s and 60s, drinking bourbon and telling stories that sounded too crazy to be true. They talked about the time Jenkins glided into a German motor pool and destroyed 30 trucks before anyone fired a shot. They talked about the time Morrison's engine wouldn't restart and he belly landed in a farmer's field, walked away without a scratch, and was back at base by dinner. They talked about the missions that should have killed them, but didn't. But mostly, they talked about Reynolds, the crazy bastard who started it all, the man who looked at a 7-ton fighter plane and saw a glider, the pilot who understood that sometimes the best weapon isn't the biggest gun or the fastest plane. Sometimes the best weapon is knowing when to shut up. Reynolds died in 1985. He was 68 years old. His funeral was simple. A few of the old guys from the 57th showed up. They stood around the grave in their old leather flight jackets, gray-haired and stooped, telling stories and laughing about the bad food and the cold tents in Italy. Then Miller stood up. Red Miller, the wingman who had watched Reynolds dive into the Brenner Pass that morning in August 44. Miller was 70 now, his red hair long gone to white. He raised a glass of whiskey. His voice cracked. "To Jack," he said, "the only pilot I ever knew who could shut up long enough to win a war. The P-47 Thunderbolt is remembered today as a brute, a beast, the heaviest single-engine fighter of World War II. You can see them in museums now, massive chunks of aluminum and steel hanging from ceiling cables or sitting on display pedestals. People look at them and see power. They see the 8 machine guns in the wings. They see the bomb racks. They read the placard that says 2,000 horsepower. They imagine the roar, the noise that shook the ground and rattled windows. They don't see the glider. They don't know that inside that metal beast was the soul of a hawk. They don't know that on a cold morning in 1944, that machine did something that defied its own nature. It became weightless. It became invisible. It became silent. The tactic Reynolds invented was never officially documented in American tactical manuals. The Army Air Forces never formally recognized it. The colonels and generals never wrote it into doctrine. It was too dangerous, too unorthodox, too dependent on individual pilot skill and sheer luck. But the pilots knew, the ground crews knew, the Germans definitely knew, even if they never understood what was happening. After the war, when aviation historians started interviewing German officers about air defense in Italy, the ghost planes kept coming up. Officers described American fighters that attacked without warning, planes that appeared and disappeared like phantoms. Some thought it was a new kind of American stealth technology. Others thought their own equipment was failing. None of them guessed the truth, that American pilots were simply turning off their engines and gliding to the attack. It was too simple, too insane. No rational military would train pilots to do something that dangerous. But then again, the Americans had never been particularly rational. They built fighter planes that weighed as much as medium bombers. They sent teenagers with a few hundred hours of training to fight veterans who had been flying since the Spanish Civil War. They fought a war on two fronts while producing more weapons, vehicles, and supplies than the rest of the world combined. The Reynolds glide fit perfectly into that tradition. It was American to its core, practical, pragmatic, slightly crazy, and devastatingly effective. In 1992, an Italian historian researching World War II discovered something interesting in the German military archives that had been captured by the Allies. It was a classified report dated March 1945, just weeks before Germany's surrender. The report was from the Luftwaffe's Tactical Analysis section. It was titled, "Anomalous American Fighter Tactics in the Italian Theater." The report documented over 40 separate incidents where American P-47 fighters had attacked German positions without any acoustic warning. The analysts had ruled out equipment failure. They had ruled out operator error. They noted that attacks seemed to come from unusual angles, often from higher altitude than normal dive bombing runs. The report's conclusion was brief and chilling. The Americans have developed a method of approach that defeats our acoustic detection network. Recommend immediate research into visual-only detection systems. Recommend all critical targets be defended, assuming no acoustic warning will be available. The report was never acted on. By March of '45, Germany was collapsing. Resources for new defensive systems didn't exist. But the report proved something important. The Reynolds glide had worked. It had worked so well that the Germans knew something was happening. They just never figured out what. Today, if you visit the Brenner Pass, you can still see the scars. The tunnel at Avisio was never fully repaired during the war. After 1945, the Italians rebuilt the railroad, but they built it on a slightly different route. The old tunnel entrance, or what's left of it, is still there, overgrown with vegetation now, a dark hole in the mountainside that hasn't seen a train in 80 years. Local guides sometimes tell the story to tourists. They talk about the American pilot who flew into the tunnel and blew up a train. The details get fuzzy in the retelling. Some versions have Reynolds flying through the tunnel itself, which is physically impossible. Some versions have him crash landing on the mountain and walking home, which didn't happen. But the core of the story remains true. A man turned off his engine at 12,000 feet. He glided into one of the most heavily defended positions in Italy. He destroyed a 30-car ammunition train, and he flew home to tell about it. The next time you see a picture of a P-47 Thunderbolt, don't just look at the guns. Look at the propeller. Imagine it frozen. Imagine the wind whistling over the canopy. Imagine the courage it took to reach out and kill the engine, to trust the physics, to fall into the valley of death without making a sound. That is the legacy of the Reynolds glide. That is the sound of victory. Or rather, that is the silence of victory. Reynolds never got a medal for the Avisio tunnel raid. The mission was too classified at the time, and by the time details could be released, too many years had passed. The Army had moved on to Korea, then Vietnam. World War II heroes became old men telling stories that young people didn't always believe. But medals don't matter much in the end. What matters is what you do when the chips are down. What matters is whether you find a way to solve the impossible problem. What matters is whether you have the guts to try something new when the old ways are getting people killed. Captain Jack Reynolds had that kind of guts. He looked at a 7-ton fighter plane and saw possibility instead of limitation. He looked at the deadliest valley in Italy and figured out how to turn death into silence. And on a summer morning in 1944, he proved that sometimes the most powerful weapon in war isn't the biggest bomb or the fastest plane. Sometimes the most powerful weapon is the courage to turn off the engine and trust the fall, the ghost run, the silent attack, the glide into darkness. That was Reynolds' gift to the war effort. That was his contribution to victory. And if you listen carefully, on quiet mornings in the Italian Alps, maybe you can still hear it. The sound of 7 tons of American steel falling through the sky in absolute silence, the whisper of wind over aluminum, the whistle of death arriving on wings that weren't supposed to glide. The thunderbolt that learned to be a ghost, the jug that learned to be a hawk, the pilot who knew when to be quiet.